I really believe we can get to a point where neurological and neuropsychiatric diseases are no longer stigmatized in the way that they currently are. We really think about them as physical disorders of the brain, and we have ways to actually treat them. We have ways to better understand what particular subtype someone is of a condition. We can much better predict what type of therapy they're going to respond to. It's not necessarily going to be a brain implant, it might be cognitive behavioral therapy. I just think we're at a point where the science is actually almost there. And it's really about how we get these out to people. And I honestly believe in the next 10 years, how we think about the brain, how we think about treating the brain, is going to radically change.
I'm very happy to be joined today by Jacques Carolan. I think we're just going to dive straight into it. You are a program director at ARIA, which is a very interesting organization, and I hope that you'll tell us a bit about it. Could you maybe just start with telling us who you are and what you do basically as a program director at ARIA?
Absolutely, yeah. So thank you so much. So excited to be here. ARIA is ultimately a UK-based R&D funding agency, really with the express mission of pursuing research into areas that seem speculative, but if true, could really be transformational on a global scale. And we were established by an Act of Parliament. So you can actually go in and read this Act of Parliament. And it actually gives us a huge amount of spectrum to really pursue bold long-term visions. Maybe some of your listeners might be familiar with DARPA. That's a kind of reasonable first order approximation of what we can do. But we have the unit of what we do are built around these programs. So programs are very kind of mission-driven R&D efforts where we think that if we could just demonstrate these things, we could really turn the area turn the dial in an area that's massively impactful. Another unique part to it is we have program directors. So I'm a program director. And my job is to come in, really set the research vision, direct funds towards what we want to do. And then when the program's actually up and running and we've selected projects, actually to manage it. So I'm speaking with all our teams regularly, really making sure things are going well. If things are working out, we can double down. If things aren't working, we can pivot or even shut down projects. And we're looking at a number of different areas. So we've got efforts in next-gen computing hardware, AI safety, robots, and I joined ARIA to really stand up the neurotechnology program.
Which is a very exciting program. I feel like neurotech has been booming a bit in the last few years, or like at Foresight where I work, it's definitely been our most like fast growing program with the most interest. Could you just tell us like, what is it that you work on in that program? What are the opportunities that you're looking at?
Yeah, absolutely. So, for your listeners that aren't familiar with neurotechnology, maybe I can just give a quick primer. So, neurotechnology is really any way to interface with the brain to either read out signals or in a targeted way actually modulate brain signals. So why might you want to do that? So maybe you have individuals with a severe motor condition, they can't communicate or they can't move, perhaps due to spinal cord injury. So what you can do is you can implant electrodes into the region of the brain associated with movement of those individuals, and then translate those intentions into an actual motor output, maybe on a computer, like the cursor on a screen. So that allows people to maybe access a computer or, even be able to control objects. So I'm sure many listeners will be familiar with companies like Neuralink. There's just a huge amount of excitement in the space. And you're right, neurotech is real growth. When I think about brain disorders, I think about things more broadly than just severe movement disorders. I think about neurological and neuropsychiatric conditions, right? So what about anxiety and mood disorders? What about addiction? What about psychosis? Actually, the spectrum is much broader. And what we're seeing is that there are early signals that neurotechnologies can actually address this much broader range of conditions than just in the kind of movement space. So that's really the opportunity that we're seeing at ARIA, that if we can build what we call next generation precision neurotechnologies, we can potentially address a much broader patient population than we can before.
I feel like neurotech is probably one of those things that's also much more advanced already than people may think, we're going to talk much more about neurotech in today's conversation, of course, but I also want to hear a little bit more about you before we dive into that, which is, I know you have this kind of unusual background in that you were in physics before you started with this, right? And how did that happen? How did you make this jump, basically?
Yeah, it's been a kind of wild journey. So I spent the first part of my career working in applied physics. So I was really trying to understand how we can use light for different forms of computation. So whether that's for new types of quantum computers that potentially compute much more quickly than our existing computers, or whether it's for new types of optical computing for AI. And I was pretty set on doing that. And I kind of worked on that for about a decade. And I really enjoyed the problems. I really enjoyed the people. But I think two things really struck me. It became clear that, the likelihood of the widget that I'm building actually being useful, whether it's an artificial atom, whether it's a single photon source, was just really, really small. And even if it was going to be useful, the time horizons and capital for actually making these things was just massive. So it became clear to me that I actually wanted to build technologies that could help people in the near term. And I was kind of having this realization just around the time the pandemic was hitting. And I was like, I wonder if I can become a neuroscientist. I had always been fascinated in the brain. I'd sat a few courses and was just always interested in the idea that physical substrates can do computation. So I essentially spent about 6 months trying to figure out whether this was a crazy idea or an awesome idea. So I was like, I'm going to read a ton of papers, I'm going to read textbooks, and I'm going to speak with a lot of people. And that was the kind of upside of the pandemic, is that lots of people had free time at their hands. So I could just message them and be like, is there any chance we could just have a quick coffee virtually for 15 minutes? And all of the physicists I spoke to were like, this is a dumb idea. You've got a great career. What are you doing? And all of the neuroscientists I spoke to were like, this is an awesome idea. You should do it. And actually, it turns out in neuroscience, there are just lots of physicists who have kind of moved over. So it actually wasn't that unique. So through that process, I actually managed to find a job in a neuroscience lab doing proper systems neuroscience. So I went from doing, microchip fabrication to doing brain surgery on mice and doing optogenetics and imaging and playing with all these tools. And I just learned so much. To put it in context, I don't have a high school biology. I was learning all of this for the first time. I was the only physicist in the room, but I learned so much throughout that process. And I think one thing kind of struck me is, like, from working in applied physics, from doing all these like hardcore engineering challenges, actually the tools we were applying to understand the brain were actually just quite primitive. So I saw this opportunity to really close this gap. If we can build new technologies, like really cutting edge technologies, apply them to the brain, what is the potential there? And that was really when ARIA was hiring their first cohort of program directors, and I kind of took this vision to them, and yeah, I ended up here.
That's so cool, and like an inspiring story, I think, of like how you can really shift careers if you want to, and not even, it seems like you didn't even need like academic credentials from the neuro world to do that.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I think I definitely didn't. I didn't have any publications in neuroscience, nothing like that. But when I went into the lab, the lasers they were using were kind of the same lasers that I used in my PhD. The optical imaging systems I could kind of build. So I think my advice is, like, take something that you think you're reasonably good at and see how you can apply that into a new area. So that definitely helped. And my other advice on this is, the people that inspire me are often the people that have just moved into different careers, actually. And just speaking with those folks, see, we're going to be working for a long time. That's the thing.
Yeah.
And, you're going to have many careers. And I think that's just so exciting.
That's really cool. Yeah. Well, let's start talking about this stuff that you're doing now. As I understand it, like, one of the main things that you're focusing on is what you call precision neurotechnologies. Could you explain to us, like, what do you mean by precision neurotechnologies?
Yeah, of course. So, I talked a bit about what neurotechnologies are, and thinking about neurotechnologies more broadly for different sets of neurological, neuropsychiatric conditions, whether that's anxiety and mood disorders, epilepsy, addiction, pain, things like this. These are conditions that many of us know people have experience with, or we've even experienced ourselves. So just the kind of societal burden of this is huge. What we're now discovering, both from a kind of basic neuroscience side, where we're doing large-scale transcriptomics on mouse brains and other animal or system brains, and from human neurophysiology, is that many of these conditions are actually disorders of circuits. So what do I mean by that? I mean that they're actually kind of distributed around the brain. When I gave the example earlier of a motor BCI, we kind of know the brain region we need to be in. We need to be in the primary motor cortex. But actually, for many of these conditions, it's not just one brain region that is at fault, if you like. It's really a distributed network. So actually having that kind of what we call circuit level access, that's really key. So we launched a program called Precision Neurotechnologies, really with the goal of increasing the precision, increasing the circuit level access of the technologies that we currently have. And if you compare this to drugs are really imprecise. You're just flooding the whole body with, that has lots of kind of physiological effects. So getting that precision, we think, is really going to be key to having much less side effects, much more personalized treatments. And that's the bet we're taking.
And it seems like very self-explanatory in that it would be great if we could really have good precision in these types of interventions, especially when it comes to the brain. It must be very matter where you end up doing an intervention. And so could you tell us what are the new tools that you're working on developing, or do you have any concrete examples of things that you're actually able to do right now, or what it is that you're developing basically?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think some helpful context, maybe just to start this, is with what a program can do. Now, my job as a program director is to say, this is the North Star. I don't know how to get there. Okay. And if I did know how to get there, I can just set up a company and do that. So we kind of set this North Star. When you do this job, you kind of have this inkling that you've pointed it in the right direction. There are people ready to do it, but you don't know. And when you first see the applications come in, because we do everything through an open call, that was when I was like, we've got something pretty special here. So I'll give you an example of some of the technologies we're developing. So one of them is we're looking at whether you can use ultrasound to modulate mood and read out parts of the brain. So this is a collaboration between Forest Neurotech and the NHS and the University of Plymouth. And the idea is, can you read out the brain state of an individual? This is actually a clinical trial. So you can read out neural activity based on Doppler effects, essentially blood flow. And based on that, can you then target specific circuit elements of the brain to actually perturb mood? So how can you do that? It turns out the neurons in our brain actually have mechanosensitive ion channels. So if you shine ultrasound in them, you squidge them, you can make them fire. This is in a reversible way. You're not causing damage, anything like that. So that's one area, and that potentially could be a non-invasive way to do that. Another area we're looking at is, can you do something to the brain where you either put in a kind of gene therapy or you put in a kind of microscopic transducer and actually increase the precision of interaction? So we're funding a team led by University College London to look at closed-loop gene therapies. This is a really cool idea where they initially developed this for epilepsy. And the idea is this gene therapy can sense when there's an increase in activity, for example, due to a seizure, and then it upregulates potassium channels, which are kind of like putting the brakes on the neurons. So in a closed loop way, it actually stops the seizure from happening. So we're funding them to look at, well, okay, can you access this in different parts of the brain? Can it be activated by ultrasound, for example, and really get the right circuit elements? And can you apply it to other conditions? And the final one I mentioned, something that we're really excited about, is in the biohybrid space. So typically, when we think about implanting electrodes into brains, a lot of effort is happening at the moment, you get this kind of mechanical mismatch between the brain, which is soft, and these silicon electrodes, which are very hard, and that could cause scarring. That can cause lots of challenges in signal integrity. And you don't really get this kind of cell type circuit access, which we believe is so important. If you could grow neurons and actually use those as an interface to the outside world. So we're funding a number of teams to actually look at this, whether you could build something akin to a kind of living DBS electrode. So I guess the kind of message there is that I think there are different levels of precision that will be required for different conditions. And what we can do at ARIA is spread bet on a variety of those and really try and support those to get through and be successful.
Very exciting. DBS, I guess, stands for deep brain stimulation, or
Yes, deep brain stimulation.
Great. Wow. Yeah, I think that's all so exciting. What are the bottlenecks, or what's happening in current neurotech that's like you haven't been able to break through? What are the bottlenecks right now?
Well, there are just so many, and that's what makes the field so exciting to be in. And I think that we can really make progress in this area. I'll just give you an example of one that I think about a lot, is that typically there is this trade-off between how precise and how accurate you can access the brain and how invasive something is. You think about this from just engineering challenges. If your neurons are sources, the closer you are to them, the better you can record from them. So you've got this trade, and precision is often can think about it as a proxy for how functional, how useful your neural interface is. So if you've got this trade-off, how do you break it? Can you have technologies that are less invasive, but still have the functionality of high-performance implantable neurotechnologies? We haven't really solved that yet. Maybe that's going to be new physics that people are developing, new biophysics. Maybe it's going to be new types of biologics that we can deploy in the brain and interact in different ways. That's just an open question, and that's really exciting.
Interesting. I read in one of your posts before this interview that you compared sort of the challenges in neurotech today to the challenges or what was happening in cardiology, and could you just tell that story and why you think that that's a useful analogy?
Yeah, absolutely. So, if we believe that neurotechnologies can be massively impactful, I think we need to take an honest, hard look at our best case. How many people do we think can actually access these in the long run, and what are going to be the barriers? And I think a great case study is deep brain stimulation for Parkinson's disease. So deep brain stimulation is a technique which is used for individuals often with movement disorders such as Parkinsonian tremor or essential tremor. And what you can do is you can implant an electrode down into a deep brain structure, typically in the basal ganglia. You provide these high frequency stimulations. And actually, if you watch the videos of this, you can see them online, it really can help suppress people's tremors. So this is a technology that's been FDA approved for probably 20, 25 years. In the US, for example, it's well reimbursed. We reasonably understand how someone's going to respond to it. But if you plot the amount of DBS procedures as a function of time, and you also plot the prevalence of Parkinson's disease, we're just massively, massively underpenetrated, well below 0.5%. And that's in the US, where it's our kind of best case scenario. So we're massively underpenetrated, and we're not increasing at the right rate. So you have these two blockers. So then the question is, why is that the case? And I would put that into two buckets. The first bucket is efficacy. For Parkinson's disease, that's a neurodegenerative disease. And when you're stimulating the brain, you're typically just treating motor symptoms. Okay? You're not actually treating the disease itself. If it was a slam dunk, I think you might see better penetration. So there's an efficacy side. And that's kind of the motivation for our first program, Precision Neurotechnologies. If we can build better circuit tools, we think we can actually address the disease in many cases, neurological and neuropsychiatric disorders. And then there's the other part, which is the procedural burden. I actually had the real privilege of watching a DBS procedure be done, I think it was last week or the week before. It's a really serious surgical procedure. Be under it sounds almost trite to say that, but that's absolutely the case. So it's a very serious surgical procedure. Implanting a device in someone comes with risks. Infection risks, bleeding risks, these are very serious. And then I also, and ultimately that drives patient hesitancy, clinician hesitancy. I also think about workforce challenges. There are only so many places you can do these types of procedures. We probably have in the UK maybe 24 max neurosurgical consultants who can do this, functional neurosurgeons. There's also just a kind of workforce. Okay, so the reason I give that whole story is I think we should think about what are examples where we have massively scaled an intervention And actually the 1950s in cardiology, I think, is a great example of that. In the 1950s, treating heart block required open heart surgery, a thoracotomy where you physically suture electrodes onto the heart. Hugely invasive last resort. The invention of the transvenous lead really transformed this. It meant that you could get the electrodes through blood vessels, through the vein, which took a last resort high-risk procedure into a low-risk outpatient procedure that's now performed millions of times around the world. So I think, that analogy, I think the question is, well, what can we learn from that? And clearly solving that invasiveness element really has driven the scale. From 20 years, they went from just half a dozen procedures to maybe 500,000 procedures. It created radical innovation in devices. Initially, the cardiac pacemakers sucked. They used nuclear batteries and they kind of broke and the leads broke. But eventually, because it was so effective, it just drove innovation. So the question I want to try and understand is, what would that look like for the brain? Now, there are many reasons why this analogy isn't perfect. We kind of have an idea of what the target is for the heart, but I still think it's a really interesting question to be like, what would drive radical innovation?
I think it's really interesting. And also, it's useful for understanding the blocker of the field right now, which is this invasiveness point that you're making. Do you think that, like, it's this question of invasiveness, is that what it's going to take to shift these types of interventions from like the last resort type of inventions to something that you do more, maybe even more proactively, like we could more proactively take care of our brain health? Is that sort of the future that you're imagining?
I think it's a great question. And I think there's going to be different buckets for different levels of severity. So, I don't think we're going to be in a position where, individuals with mild to moderate versions of a condition are going for serious brain surgery or having some kind of brain implant. But there are still many, many serious treatment-resistant people where actually you might need to do that. And then you have the second bucket, which is, how can we have much more proactive brain health? And maybe at some point, those things are going to overlap a bit. But I do think how we are thinking about the brain will radically change. And I think that's just a really exciting time to be in.
Interesting. If I poke you a little bit more, do you have could you imagine a world where we think of brain health kind of like we think about physical fitness today? Like, it's something that we know more, like this is good to do, this is not so good, and you're very proactive in your like health care in that sense. Do you think that that's a direction that we will be going in?
I absolutely think it will. We're seeing a big uptake in wearables. I think it's definitely a big area. I guess what I come back to is like, what's the science that underpins it? And I actually think we're now I go back to this idea of circuits. We are now having a much better idea that different circuits do underlie different conditions. There's some really incredible work by someone at Stanford called Leanne Williams, who takes people that have a diagnosis of depression and then puts them in an fMRI scanner. And then you can look at the connectivity between different brain regions. And what they actually see is that there are actually different subtypes of depression. And those different subtypes better predict how someone's going to respond to different treatments. And why do I say that? That is an important existence proof that just really understanding what's happening in our brain can actually have a really strong effect on whether something is going to be good for us. So that's, in a pretty kind of acute setting. But, could you then take lower resolution devices, which people might use at home, and understand you need to go out and have a walk or you need to do this type of therapy? Potentially. I think it's a really big open question, but the science underpinning it means that it might be possible.
Yeah. In your work so far, when you've met people that are maybe, just when you talk about your work, are there any conditions that keep coming up where people are like, oh, will you be able to help with this? Or like, what are the most common things that people are sort of resonating with when they're thinking about the treatments that you could potentially help provide?
Oh yeah, it's a really interesting question. I think the things that come up are certainly around mood and anxiety disorders, certainly around things like epilepsy, addiction. One of the ones that's, I think, really under-researched but has origin in the brain is chronic pain. So many people are living with chronic pain. If you can there are early signals that you might be able to modulate the brain in very, very targeted ways to actually alleviate some of that. And that could just be huge. So I think as we do more of this work, we're going to find many more conditions, but we're just really at the beginning of understanding how targeted interaction with the brain can just improve a whole range of different conditions.
Yeah, very, very interesting. So I think that something that's always interesting to ask about these days is the overlap with advances in AI research currently and other areas of science. Like, can AI help advance this scientific field? So if you think about AI for neurotech, for example, or AI for neuroscience in general, do you see that it could play an important role in accelerating discovery?
Well, absolutely, yeah. I think, I gave that example of Leanne Williams' work where they're taking big functional connectivity data and understanding biotypes of psychiatric disorders. That ultimately is using AI to do that. You're taking large data sets, you're finding out what those different subtypes are. Now, I think the key part to remember there is they start with a biological prior. So they start with an idea of the types of circuits they think are going to be implicated. And that's, I think, really important. If you have a black box approach, the brain is really complicated. And the danger is that you're actually not going to get useful things out. So I really think starting with a biological prior is going to be super, super important. We're also seeing that, for example, in some of the DBS work as well, and the deep brain stimulation work. There's some really incredible work from Chris Rosell and Helen Mayberg, and they work with patients with treatment-resistant depression. So these are individuals who have tried every single treatment and it's still not working for them, really the most severe individuals. And they implant this same electrode, which is used for Parkinson's treatments, and they implant it into part of the brain that they believe is related to modulating mood. And it can help, it can actually really help people's treatment-resistant depression. But in this experiment they have, it's a Nature paper from a couple of years ago, they actually record electrophysiological signals as well. So they have this readout in this particular region of the brain, and they actually can show that there are electrophysiological signatures which precede depressive relapses, often by weeks. They're the kind of that, if that's true, that's quite remarkable. Right? That you can say to someone, listen, we think this is coming up. You need to pay yourself that. You need to do the right things. So I think there's a huge amount of opportunity, and ultimately those will be leveraging AI, but I really think it needs to be done with biological priors and with the clinicians involved as well.
So I think if you imagine 20 years from now, looking back at the work that you are doing, it would be interesting to hear what would a really best case scenarios be, or what would make you the proudest over this work?
I think it's a really interesting question because by the nature of what we do, I don't know if the things we fund are going to be successful. That's just part of the job, and that's actually my responsibility and what I need to do, in fact. So, of course, I would love it if in 20 years, some of our technologies ended up in the clinic and were actually helping people. But there's a big uncertainty in that. So then I look at what else would make me proud. And there's something unique that we can do at ARIA, which I think is really wonderful, is just the community that we can bring together. Can we actually seed a community of really ambitious technologists and scientists to dream big and think about hard problems? And even though we're in the kind of early stages of the program, what we're doing at ARIA, there is just so much stuff happening at the moment. And I'm just really excited. We're working with a lot of what we call activation partners. We are setting up neurotechnology accelerators. We're thinking about whether we can set up focused research organizations in the UK. All of these little seeds where it's hard to kind of say this is the single thing that's happening, but it feels like there's a phase change happening. So if in 20 years that really turns out to be the case, then I'll just be delighted.
Yeah, I think it's really exciting to see how ambitiously you guys are going for this, and that it seems like with all the exciting bets that you're taking, there will be some that are really successful, or it should be, which will be beneficial to all of us. I think that's also what's really exciting about you guys, not just being another company, but actually for the people, I would say.
Absolutely. And the ambition of what we want to do is global. We want to build things that change the world, and that is, a privilege and a responsibility, and it's just an awesome place to be.
Yeah. Do you know if there are other initiatives like ARIA in other countries? I know there's Sprint in Germany. Are there,
Yeah.
and we mentioned DARPA. Is there anything else like that happening that you're aware of?
Yes, it's a great question. So you have Sprint in Germany. There are a few different versions of this. There's a version of this in Japan as well. We're seeing something related to NATO. And of course, within the US, we have the whole range of different ARPAs. You have ARPA H, ARPA E for energy, H for healthcare, DARPA, a whole spectrum of different things. I think there are not many places in the world where it can always work. And that's because I really think you need that core talent base. And that's what's so exciting about doing this in the UK is you just have a really ambitious community. And actually, maybe the thing that surprised me the most is people are really entrepreneurial. People, like early career, ambitious people aren't set with just moving into academia or working in a company. They want to build their own thing. They want to do something really ambitious. And I think it's great that ARIA can kind of give them that permission to dream bigger.
And that's actually an interesting point also, is you don't have to be from the UK to work at ARIA, right? You can actually, if you're interested in these fields, you could come from anywhere.
Absolutely. So certainly in terms of who we employ, we're very, very international. We have program directors from around the world. We want to get the best talent into the agency. And in terms of the projects that we fund, ultimately our responsibility is to the UK taxpayer. So the majority of things we fund are in the UK, but we have some flexibility around that. So in my program, we're funding a lot of international partnerships where the majority of work is in the UK, but actually by leveraging an exceptional, for example, US partner, you can do something that's just not possible otherwise. So that's actually a really important part of the model. And I think lots of people have been wanting to be involved in this program because it just gives them that flexibility, gives them the ability to work on something really, really hard, really ambitious.
Yeah, that's a prompt for anyone interested to check out ARIA's website also. I know you have a lot of things happening and a lot of interesting information on there. So I think also another thing in sort of taking it back a bit to what we were talking about, your first program on precision neurotechnologies. You had this program thesis where you talk about measure, model, perturb. And I didn't know what perturb was. I had to Google translate it when I read about it. But could you walk us through that and why it's actually like a really powerful way of thinking about treating brain disorders?
Yeah, absolutely. And so that's also the kind of awesome thing about ARIA is we can put out these documents, get feedback from people. And I think that's just great. We build in public on this measure, model, perturb idea. So the starting point there was like, well, okay, we've got all of these awesome early stage, much better circuit level technologies. So what? Can they actually do something useful? So can we actually apply these technologies and think about moving the brain from a pathological state to a more physiological state? And that's kind of like a control theory problem. So you have this big dynamical system of the brain. You have a brain state. Lots of people argue about what a brain state is, but it's just some kind of low-dimensional representation of the firing patterns of lots of neurons. And you want to figure out how to nudge the brain from, say, a pathological state, like having a seizure, to a much more physiological state, so not having a seizure. So what you want to do is you want to read out the brain. So that's measure, build some computational model that really tells you how to perturb the brain to your more physiological state. You then do it. So that's the kind of perturb, and you see where you are. And probably you're not exactly where you expect you are. So you measure, you then update your computational model and you perturb the brain again. So really it's about how can we predictably perturb and drive the brain from unhealthy states to healthy states. And, we talked a bit about AI. How can we leverage advances in computational techniques and in AI to do that in a much more efficient way?
Interesting. And I know another thing that I read on your site was this, that you've set out like precision metrics. Could you tell a little bit more about why you think this kind of systematic framework is important, or like why do we need that and what is it used for basically?
Yeah. So a lot of what we do at ARIA is very, very metric driven. We're trying to get people to do really hard things in really short periods of time. And the way we essentially de-risk that is we have these concrete metrics. So we know if things are working or not. So, and if you ask the teams that apply to our program, they'll probably be really annoyed because it was kind of a pain to write down and put together for the application process. But I came up with what I thought were the four most important parts of interacting with circuits. So the first part was cell type specificity. In our brain, we have many thousands of different cell types. Some of them are excitatory, some of them are inhibitory, and they do radically different things downstream. So having that specificity, we believe, is really important. We also ask for things like the field of view. We want to make sure we can access as much of the brain as possible. The voxel size, how accurately can you target particular circuit elements? And even the number of voxels, how many different handholds can you have on the brain? And why would you want to do that? Well, there's a notion which is called Hebbian plasticity. Neurons that fire together, wire together. So if there is a particular circuit that is underregulated, if you can turn on two different parts of that circuit, maybe you can actually increase the connection strength. Or if it's overregulated, maybe you can even downregulate it by changing the timing. So it was having this circuit level access that was really important. And that's why there's a very annoying equation.
Well, I can also, again, recommend the website where you have papers on this and everything. And another thing that we should touch on is this Precision Neurotechnologies is your first program within this scalable neural interfaces, interest area of ARIA. There's a lot of different levels to this, but you also, I think, are thinking about your second program, maybe. Do you want to talk a little bit about what you're thinking about there?
Absolutely. And I'll just say you've absolutely nailed the ARIA terminology. Well done, Beatrice. So we have this broad space, scalable neural interfaces, and we have the first program, which is thinking about how we can build precision neurotechnologies. Outside of that main program, we've got little seed projects, smaller pots of money, more speculative bets. We haven't announced those yet, but we can do that very soon. And then, I've been thinking a lot about what else would it look like if ARIA was to do something in this space. So this blog post, this Substack I put out around massively scalable neurotechnologies was really planting a flag and just trying to get some feedback around this idea. But I think what's become clear to me is that we really do need to think about radically different ways to actually access the brain. And if I think about what were the drivers in the 90s of the transvenous lead, it was really the transistor. Actually, Earl Bakken, who founded Medtronic, was inspired by the transistorized metronome. That was how he came up with it. So now the question is, what are the frontier technologies of our current age? And I really think it's going to be leveraging advances in biology, engineered biology, and frontier hardware. So can we build very, very small devices that can traverse the blood vessels to get to the right brain region? Can we think about maybe using the cerebrospinal fluid? And can we leverage advances in cellular biology to have cellular systems that can autonomously track, be delivered in the periphery, autonomously get to the brain region that we want? I think there's just a huge amount of white space there that has really been untouched. So that's what we're trying to figure out now. So we haven't launched this program yet. We're still getting feedback and figuring out whether this is the direction we want to go in.
Well, yeah, it'll be interesting to follow, I guess, to see if this becomes another one of your programs. For now, I think I'll share along with this episode, this post that you've written about it, if people want to check it out. So I think I want to sort of start wrapping up with a few questions where we focus on maybe the more human side of your work and on these technologies. So these technologies obviously focus on something very intimate, which is our brains, our identities. What are the ethical and societal challenges that you see in developing and deploying them? What can we do to make sure that we don't just develop these technologies, but they're also distributed and used in a safe way that's accessible and equitable?
So I think it's so important. And, I will say to begin, certainly in the first instance, I think these technologies are going to be used only in very severe treatment refractory patients. I think we're a long way off healthy people having elective, serious brain surgery treatments. But you're absolutely right. There are still ethical issues. We're talking about, identity. We're talking about cognition. We've actually funded a whole stream at ARIA to get people to look into this. So we've got people thinking about how we can build much more equitable technologies, how we can engage with folks with lived experiences and actually integrate those into the learnings of our program.
And I know you've done like patient engagement work also. What have you learned about what are people willing to accept?
Yeah, it's a great question. And the short answer is it's complicated. It just really depends on the individual. Things that me or you think are not invasive might be invasive to certain people. So for example, maybe having to wear a headset is actually really invasive in people's lives. Or maybe you have certain cultures where mental illness has a serious stigma around it still, and wearing a headset is actually going to be a blocker. Or if you need to use a technology and you have to shave your head, actually for a lot of people that also is a blocker. I think the key point is just really engaging folks with lived experiences to understand what those challenges are. So that's something we're doing a lot within the program, is actually helping our teams to work with people with lived experiences, the conditions they have, understand what are the key factors. And that does a few things. One, it just helps them build better technologies and better products. But two, it just puts a fire underneath them, right? If you really meet the people who actually need these things, that's the thing that gets you up every day and says, okay, we need to work harder. We need to build quicker. It's just such a critical thing.
It was really cool. Yeah, I was at the ARIA summit that you guys organized earlier this year, and you had patients there, and it was really cool to see people that had like these top of the line neurotech implants. For example, there was, I don't remember, you probably know this better than I do, but the guy that had surgery and he had like these neural stimulators that helped treat his depression and stuff like this. Like that must just be amazing to see happen IRL.
Absolutely. I mean, so that individual talking about is John Nelson. You know, he's become a good friend now, and hearing him talk about his experience, you know, I'd urge all your listeners to go and check it out. If you search John Nelson ARIA Summit, the video is actually there. And hearing him talk about his life, talk about every day wanting to die, nothing being able to help him, and this treatment saves his life. For me, that still puts the hairs on the back of my neck. And that is just a massive driver for me to be like, we need to build these every day we are delaying doing this. There are people dying. It sounds like an extreme thing, but that's ultimately why we're building these technologies, is to help people. So I feel very privileged that I get to meet folks like that and work with them. And, yeah, I take it very seriously.
Yeah. No, I highly definitely recommend checking that talk out. Have you ever had like in your research like a moment or a breakthrough where you think like this changes everything?
Oh my God. Yeah, I've had a few. And also that's the fun thing about working across so many different technologies and sciences. I think about this moment when you're in the lab and you're like, I did not expect this to happen. So I'll give you two examples, both in the kind of brain space. The first one was when I saw expression of calcium indicators in a live mouse. So you can express these genetically encoded calcium indicators, which means that the neurons light up. You image them with a 2-photon laser. And so you can see the neurons and you can see when they fire. So there's a mouse on the table, there's a laser pointing at its head, you're recording the neurons fire, and you clap and the neurons light up. And that moment of just seeing the brain as a kind of machine where there's inputs and there's outputs, I was like, this is incredible. I'll give you another example, which is actually much more recent. I went to visit the functional neurosurgery clinic department in the UK over at Queen's Square, and had the real privilege to do this. And one of the individuals was an older lady with essential tremor. So she had very, very severe tremor, and she was undergoing a thalectomy. So this is where you ablate the thalamus, which is the kind of relay station for the brain. And this is a procedure that they do while someone is awake. So we're sitting there and this lady's on the table and they ask her to draw a spiral, and she can't do it at all. It's just all over the place because the tremor is so extreme. Then they go into her brain, they target the thalamus, they put the small probe there, and she puts her hand back to her face and the tremor's just suppressed. And they apply a very small electrical current for about 60 seconds and the tremor's almost completely gone, basically completely gone. And she's awake, and just seeing how delighted she was, seeing how quickly it can be done. She can now go back to driving again. She can now go back like drinking again. Like, all of these little things we take for granted, and see that happen so quickly. That was as close to magic as I think you can get. So I feel very privileged to have experienced that.
Both those examples sound, yeah, I can see why they're profound. That's actually, it leads me to want to ask you another question, which is just like, do you have any like favorite YouTube clips or something? Like, where should people go if they want to like see what the cutting edge of neurotech is right now? Do you have any recommendations?
Well, absolutely. This is awesome. So, certainly looking at some of the speech work from Sergei Stavisky, I think is really, really incredible. So they're taking patients with, I think, motor neuron disease, unable to communicate, implanting electrodes into a motor part of the brain related to speech, lip movement. And you see them translate the brain signals into speech in real time. A few videos related to this, but they're really, really emotional when you see someone's family be able to speak to, their family member again. It's just really incredible. So I'd get folks to look at that. Definitely look at, there's lots and lots of the tremor stuff as well. It's just really amazing what we can do.
That sounds amazing. I'm gonna look at that after our call. So looking ahead, if everything goes right, what's the sort of best, existential hope future that you can imagine for what we can do with neurotech?
Yeah, I really believe we can get to a point where neurological and neuropsychiatric diseases are no longer stigmatized in the way that they currently are. We really think about them as physical disorders of the brain, and we have ways to actually treat them. We have ways to better understand what particular subtype someone is of a condition. We can much better predict what type of therapy they're going to respond to. It's not necessarily going to be a brain implant. It might be cognitive behavioral therapy. I just think we're at a point where the science is actually almost there, and it's really about how we get these out to people. And I honestly believe in the next 10 years, how we think about the brain, how we think about treating the brain, is going to radically, radically change.
Yeah, that's really interesting and a really important point that we maybe haven't touched on yet, but that point of if you're actually able to see and show what a lot of these behaviors are coming from, you no longer have to like think that you're crazy because you're imagining it or something like that, because we can actually show it's physical or like it's real.
Exactly. There's a physical basis behind it. Yes, 100%.
Yeah. So, for anyone who has listened to this, where should they look to follow or get involved with your work and ARIA's work?
Absolutely. So check out our website for sure. That's aria.org.uk. You can see all of our upcoming program announcements there, all of our seed announcements. There's a button you can click which says follow, and you can get updates sent to you. So definitely check out that. Check out the ARIA Substack. We put things out every month. Yeah, and we would absolutely love your listeners to get involved.
That's perfect. Thank you so much, Jacques. It was really, really nice to talk to you and hear about all the exciting stuff and very important work that you're doing. So very curious to follow.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here.